Good morning, everyone. My name is Jack Atwell. I'm going to be taking your webinar today. Thank you for joining me this morning. If you do have any questions, please put them in the chat. I'm going to give it a couple of more minutes for a few more people to join, and then we'll actually start the webinar. Right, those of you who've just recently joined the webinar, so my name is Jag Atwell. I'm going to be taking you through the webinar today. If you do have any questions, please pop them in the chat, and then my colleague Hilary will be answering the questions. So the agenda for this morning is we're going to be looking at is logging in issues, how to log in and the best practices, merging accounts and how to do that for your siblings. We're looking at audience groups, so how to manage audience groups and how to change them and edit them. We'll also be looking at refunds and transferring to siblings, how to find your organization code for your app. We'll be going through the levers process as well. And we'll be looking at trips and visits as well. Okay, so I'm going to minimize that. Okay, so the very first thing with logging in issues, if I go to Wisepay dashboard, so what I would always recommend is when you go to manage account profiles and you have a parent that rings up and says, look, I can't get into my Wisepay account, you would search for the pupil. So in this instance, I'm just going to click on A and find Sophie Aaron. So once I've found Sophie Aaron, I would click on Sophie Aaron, I would scroll down, and what I would always recommend is that you check the email address that is correct. If that is correct, then what you can do is send a reset password. The other thing that we find sometimes for the instance, when I click into the email address, is sometimes there's a space in there. So that can also cause problems as well. So I would always recommend just deleting that space that is there, send the reset password, and that should be able to be reset the password for that particular person. Now, the other thing to bear in mind is when some of the feedback that we've had on our support calls is when somebody, a parent, Google's Wisepay login, for example, they end up at the very first page, which is essentially the school login. So it's very important that you do point that out, that this is not the parent login portal from that perspective. So it is very important that you do make them aware of that they're logging into the correct page from that. Okay, so the next thing we're going to have a look at is merging accounts. So if I look at, go back into the dashboard, again, if I was looking at merging account, you have got quite a few problems with merging account. A couple of things to remember here with merging account. First thing is that the parent should always merge the older sibling into the younger sibling's account. So that's quite important from that perspective, because if it's done the other way around, what ends up happening is when the older sibling leaves, it basically skews the younger sibling account. If you find that they used to work and it wasn't quite working before, what you do, you find again the pupil and you click on remove merged data, and that removes all of the data that's merged. Then what you would recommend is for the parent to log in to the youngest child's account and then merge the older accounts into that. And that's the way you should be doing merging accounts. from that perspective, but it's the removing merge your data account if you have any issues from that perspective. So that's quite important from that issue. So that is essentially merging accounts for siblings. It's important that you do it from the youngest account. Audience groups. So if I have a look at audience groups, so return to Wisepay dashboard and manage audience groups. Okay, so to create an audience group, I would just simply click on audience group here, add audience group button just essentially there. I would always give it a title, so if I was going to call it history class, and I would always give it an academic year. So in this instance, I would say history class, year 10, 21, 22. So therefore I know that it applies to that particular year. I would click on add there, and then simply I would search for any person that I would like to add to that group. So if I wanted to add Harry, for example, I would click on Harry, just yes there, and that click on save group membership, and that would then add Harry to that particular group. From that perspective, I would then go repeat that process in order to add any additional pupils that I wanted to add. Now, the thing to remember with the feedback that we've had with audience groups is once you've completed your audience group, it doesn't automatically update the next year. So if you wanted to, let's say, add more people in for the next year in September for 22, 23, you would have to physically go into this particular group and add it, or you would start a new group. What you can also do, if I click on save group membership, return to administration area, look at my audience groups there, and where is my history group? There we go. So 21, 22, and there it is. Now, one of the key things that we have come across is that people don't delete or tidy or archive their audience groups. It's not a problem, but where it does become an issue is that if you do have lots and lots of groups and you're not archiving them away, what ends up happening is that you have to go scroll through all of those audience groups. So what we recommend is either you delete. So in this instance, I would delete the history group. This is how you prefer you want to delete it, you'd say yes. So it will automatically delete that group, or you can archive it. So when you're assigning an audience group to a product or a trip, you're not having to scroll down several groups to find the group that you've created. So it is very important that you do a lot of maintenance in your audience groups, otherwise you end up with a load of list of all audience groups that are essentially very old and you don't use them. For example, I've got an audience group here for Universal Free School Meals 2017. So once I finish with that, I click on it, I can edit it and add it. One thing key to remember here is once the school year, the academic school year ends, audience groups do not automatically get updated. You have to manually add new people to the audience groups. So it's not something like, for example, if you've got pupils in year 7, they automatically roll over to year 8. This does not happen with audience groups. So it's very important. A lot of schools have fed back to us to say, look, I don't understand the concept from that perspective on the audience groups. So it's something that's manual. Once you create it, that is the list of pupils that are in the audience group. If you want to add, you have to come back in and click on the audience group. So for example, the 3G trip to Bath. Just thinking about it. And then I would go away and search for, let's say if I want to add Harry again and search, I want to add that particular Harry there. I've saved group membership and now Harry Angler is now part of that group. So that's essentially to do with audience groups. So if I return back to the Wisepay dashboard, the next thing we're going to have a look at is refunds and transferring to siblings. Okay, so if I click on manage account profiles, and I'm going to search for, okay, so if it was Sophie Aaron from that perspective that was leaving, I click on Sophie Aaron. And what I can do is if I scroll all the way down to the bottom, I can open the Income Manager report. Okay. So from this instance, to do a refund, what we can do if it's got the refund there, I click on the refund, and then providing you've got this permission, it would allow you to refund. Now, what you can do as well, just I think we might not have this, is they've got some more information. So if I click on the information here, that will show installment history. But if I click on that particular information here, it will bring up, and in this instance it won't, but it will bring up your card details, so you can actually check the expiry date of the card from that perspective here, so you can see that it hasn't expired. So that is how you would essentially do refunds as well. So it's just simply you have an R against it. If you have that permission set, click on the R, and then you can choose the refund amount. Then you click here to continue. Now, if you want to transfer this to a sibling, I would click on the T there. So the target account, that's the original account, so I would then go away and find the sibling. So let's say it was odd. Normally it would have the sibling in here. So if I wanted to, let's say the account user was a sibling, you could then choose to transfer the money to various different products. The only way you can do this though is if your bank account is the same for all products. If let's say for your cashless catering, you have a different bank account, and this was just a top up for cashless catering, you will only be able to transfer the money from cashless catering to cashless catering because you use the same bank account. So that is, if you use the same bank account for all products, then you will see all the products listed there that you can transfer the money to. You can choose to part transfer as well, or you can transfer the whole amount. Once you do that, you would click on press the button to perform the transfer, and then that will automatically transfer the amount that you've selected to that product for the sibling account. So that is essentially refunds and transferring to siblings. Next thing we're going to have a look at is how to find your organisation code. So to find your organisation code, if you go to User and Parent View, click here, and it says there right at the top, just above all the modules, download the new Wisepay app, view organisation code here. If I click on that particular banner there, I know it's not sometimes extremely obvious, but if I click here, your organisation code will be displayed there. And they will need this organisation code to download the app, essentially. Well, you get the app and then to connect it to your particular school. That is essentially there. What I would recommend is that you put it on your company website, or your school website, I should say, not your company website, that you can put it there as well. So it is important that is how you find your organisation code. Okay, now going back to dashboard. Okay, with the leavers process, it is actually documented here just under the start and end year of administration, just under quick links. So if I click on that, for example, and the heading that we're actually after is management of leavers, so leavers process. So if I click on that, and this again depends on which extraction bit of software that you use, if you use Group Call Exporter or Wand. What I would recommend is that you do your refunds and transfers before you do this process. If your school does use Group Call Exporter, it would automatically mark the accounts as leavers. Well, it would disable the accounts, I should say, sorry, not mark them as leavers. And then what you would do, you would go into manage account profiles, search for the status disabled, and then you would tick that particular account or a list of accounts that you want to mark as leavers, and you would save all accounts as leavers. If you use one, you will have to basically do that process manually and disable the accounts. So that's the two differences. So I will show you an example of that. So I'll go back to dashboard account, manage account profiles. So there you go. So I've just created an example there. So that particular account is disabled. I would tick that particular box there, and I would say save all ticked accounts as leavers. But again, it's important to remember that you do the refunds and the transfers prior to ticking them as leavers. And you would always obviously have your list if it was a year 7 or it was year 6, or sorry, year 11, I should say, or the 6th one's a year 12 or 13. You would have the whole list in there if you use Group Report Exporter, and it would be marked as disabled. You would have to tick them each individually, and you would have to then save them as leavers, and that will then archive them away from that perspective. Right, trips and visits module. So let's have a look at the trips and visits module. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go through this whole process from start to finish. So to create a trip, I click on Add New Product. We're going to go for the title, good old Warwick Castle. Cool. So that is essentially that. Editors, you leave that as default. Number of places, we can choose, I'm going to say 50. If it was not applicable, you can click on not applicable, and that puts in a minus 999. And likewise, if places are not mandatory, or it's something, let's say you're selling tickets to Bonfire Night display, you might not want the tickets available there, so you could actually just put minus 59s in there. But in this instance, I'm going to do 50. Ledger code and cost center code is completely optional. It's entirely up to you if you do use that. The bank account, if you only have one bank account in there, so that will be set as default. The expiry date is essentially a time in the future where the trip has expired. So I'm going to put that, let's have a look. So if we're going to have the trip in April, I'm just going to set that to May and 2022. Department ID is again optional. At this point, before we click on continue, we haven't actually chosen who we want to, which audience group we want this trip to be applicable to. But once I click on continue, it starts to open up the whole trip. So before I do anything else, what I'm going to do is turn on auto scrolling on, which makes life a little bit easier. So at this point, we've got it available to everyone. If we want it to be available to certain groups, I click on can only be viewed by selected groups. So here, depending on which school that you're from, you might have key stages, you'll have year group, and you'll have class. So what you can do is, let's say if you wanted it to be year 1 and you wanted to hold the control button down and have it year 2 as well, that will allow you to select both. And one of the other quirky things people have had feedback about is, what about if we didn't want to select year groups and it was by mistake and we wanted to select class instead? How do we deselect year 1 and year 2? So what you do is you hold the control button down, and that deselects any choices that you might have selected on in the year group or the class group. So the control key is the key that you need to remember. So if you want to choose more than one, or you want to deselect all of those fields and all of those options in that particular field, and you think, right, actually you want to choose first year and hold control class 12. Likewise, this is why it's important that you do clear up your audience groups. If you don't archive or delete them, you're going to have to scroll all the way down to find the correct audience group. You can add individual students as well to the list. What I always recommend is that if it's going to be more than one student that's bespoke going to be added to this particular trip, I would just go away and add them to that audience group. It's far more efficient and an easier way of doing it. Once you're happy with that, you would click on save. I, in this instance, am going to leave it as can be viewed by everyone. What you've also got in above each little heading is a help button. So if I click on the help button there for trip details, this is a really useful tool. Essentially, what it does, it gives you a breakdown and a description of what all the fields do. So it gives you, all of that. So if you ever do get stuck, you're not sure what a particular field does or what it actually is meant to do, it's always worthwhile clicking on the help at the top there. Next section, what you've got is you've got add description images for trips. So in the summary, this is where you would put your letter, trip letter from that perspective. You can put it in there, which some schools do, or you can actually choose to upload it into a Word document, and you can choose the title as well. So if you are going to do that, it's a bit like attaching a document essentially. You can enter the title there. Checkout notes is the very last box that they will see when they check out. So you could put something in there, for example, don't forget to bring your wellies or something along those lines. What you've got here then is you've got screen images and high-res image. So the difference between the two, screen images just for still pictures, and the high-res images are for the GIFs or the GIFs that move. So if I click on screen images there, and I choose where's my Warwick Castle, there it is, and I say yes, that's fine. And then what you've got here is home highlight page. Now when the parent logs in, there's a banner that runs along the bottom of all the modules, which automatically, if I say yes, it would automatically put this trip into that particular banner. Now, it is a very good option to have, but you don't want to put everything in there, because if you start putting everything in there, essentially it becomes very ineffective. Click on continue here. And because I did the auto scrolling on earlier, that's what essentially does. It saves me from scrolling down. Now what you've got here is probably one of the most important things to remember from a trip perspective. Is it a fixed or variable product? Now what does that essentially mean? A fixed product is essentially it's a set price. That is the price. There's no deviation from that price. So it's one price and that's it. Installments also, if it's a trip that has installments, it's got to be a fixed product. A variable product, the example that I always use is the Year 11 Leavers hoodie. So for example, if you can want to just order a standard one with all the children's names on that leaving, it's £20. And if you want to have your nickname printed on there with embroidery, it's an additional £5. If that was the case, in that instance, that is a variable product. Now, if you choose the incorrect one here at this instance, I think I'm trying to set up a trip that's once installments and I click on variable, you can't go back in and change it. You have to start the whole trip again. So it is important from that perspective that you do remember which one you are creating. If you ever do forget, again, the help is very useful. So if I click on help again, it will tell me, there you go. So the fixed is product with single price, non-cost options, can be paid by installments. So the variable one in this example that we've got is a rugby shirt with embroidery and so on and so forth. So it is important that you remember which one you're doing for which product. But if you do forget, don't panic or don't worry. The help is there to remind you of what each one's do. If I click on continue for this instance, next question it's asking me is, can the payment be made by installments? If I say yes, I'll simply click on that, click on continue. Okay, so if there is a deposit, the way we would recommend is just put the total price in, including the deposit. So if I say it's going to be £50 on this trip, number of installments, if I say it's going to be 5, I click on continue, it will now create all of those particular payments for me. So what I could do is, if I wanted to say, right, actually installment 1, I wanted to call it deposit. And what I can do is I can say installment 1. I'll get the type. Castle point. Okay, and what I can do as well, I can put in a date. So I could say the 1st of the 12th, 1 and save. And that will put a due date on there. So it just acts as a reminder from a parent's perspective. What I might think is actually I want to make the deposit a bit more and I want a less installment. So what I could do is I could actually delete installment 5. And you do that by just simply clicking on the minus there. If you hover over it, sometimes it doesn't. Okay, so what I could do then is I could go edit for that particular one and change that to £20, change the price to £20. Here, click on save, and that will then change the deposit. Now what you've got here is add additional products options. So if I was to click on that, it's got various different options in there. So it's got cost options, which allow multiple choice with cost associated. Single cost option, it's just one. Variable cost option, it allows the customer to, or the parent in this instance, to enter a price. Admin charge essentially is if you wanted to, let's say you're doing top-ups of school dinners and you wanted to charge a admin charge if they did a top-up of less than £1, so you could set that up as well. Name and address is just a pre-formatted address layout. Contact details, again, if you're collecting those from the parent's perspective, you could do that. Text field is a simple line of text entry. So for example, let's pretend if this was a trip that was going abroad and you wanted to collect the passport numbers. If I click on text field, I can edit there, and what I could do is please enter the passport number below, click on save, and now the parent can enter the passport number. Click on additional products options there. So that's the text field. Paragraph field is exactly the same, just allows you to put in more texts. Tick boxes and drop down selection boxes are essentially variable options. One allows you to choose multiple options, and the drop down selection box will only allow you to choose one, which are non-price related. Section heading is something that you could use, let's say if you were collecting both pupil and parents information, you could have a section heading that says pupils information and another section heading that had parents information. The compulsory completion field is something that's very useful. So if I wanted to put that information in there and say, right, I'm happy, let's say I agree to the following terms, and you put all your terms and conditions in there, following terms, and you put them all in there, and that means essentially the parent has to tick that box in order to book a place onto a Warwick Castle trip. The last option that you've got is a GDPR consent field. So as we're collecting passport information in this instance, you might find that you want to put in a GDPR compulsory completion field. So if I click on that, and that puts it in there. Now the options that you've got left at the bottom are preview, which we will have a look at very shortly, which allows you to have a look at it, what it looks like if I was a parent and I was going to pay and book on a trip to Warwick Castle. Archive is obviously once the trip is done, dusted, and you would archive it there. And then it's got these two buttons which are quite important as well. Unpublish is a bit of an unusual word, but it basically means the item is safe to draft. So in reality, what that essentially means is that you can make changes to this trip, but nobody can actually visibly see it and it can't book on place onto it. Publish now, basically, once that button is hit, that means it's live. That means parents who have access to it, who you've chosen to give access to. So we did, well, I've did it in this instance, it could be everyone, but if you'd selected your groups, that means they will be able to book on and go and see it. I would always recommend that if you are apprehensive about using trips and you're not quite certain, always just leave it in draft mode. Ask your colleague for advice if it's to do with price or whatever it is, and then come back and make changes. Now let's have a look at what this trip essentially looks like. If I click on preview, there is the image that I essentially uploaded. Places available still 50. The price depends on essentially what option that I've chosen. So if I want to pay everything I can do, or I can just say, actually, I just fancy paying the £20, and that's essentially fine for the deposit. If it was a residential, overseas trip, I could just put my passport number in there. And at the moment, it says, please agree to the required fields. So in that instance, it won't allow me to purchase until I tick both yes, I agree and yes, I consent to that particular GDPR. Once I untick either of these, it just says, please agree to required fields. So they do have to agree from that instance, from both of those perspectives. And then from that instance, they would click on purchase, and they would then go away and purchase the place from that instance. And with trips on Business Manager, you would see available to everyone. Where is the White Castle trip? There it is. It's in published. That is where you would see the trip. If you did have manual payments, you could make manual payments. If there were any transactions, so manual payments would be cash payments. And also, it's how I recommend that you do. If you have bursary payments, that's a recommended way I would say to do that. Transactions will show you all the transactions for that particular trip. So let's say if I can find a trip that does have transactions against it. Okay, on that instance, that's fine. Let's have a look. And there you go. So that's what it would look like from a trip perspective. So you would see all the transactions against that trip that all the pupils have made. And now, are there any questions that have been asked, or anybody's got any questions they'd like to ask? I'll give you a few seconds to type if anybody has any questions. Okay, it looks like there's no questions. In that case, thank you very much for your time, everybody, and I hope you will find that very useful.